Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I drop my kid off at school and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Can we just talk about what a treasure Rodney Smith is? Rodney Smith, if you don't know who he is the proprietor and primary character in the Watch It Played series on YouTube, as well as partner with Board Game Geek, so he does a series of videos for them. He's eminently likable, very charming, and pretty funny. If you haven't seen any of his videos, I highly recommend them. They're a really solid way to learn to play a game, and he's a pretty entertaining guy. He's been doing a series of videos for a while now called Table Talk, where he proposes a kind of editorial about a particular subject and spends maybe 15 minutes talking about it. And then he opens up commentary on his channel, on the YouTube channel where it's posted, as well as on Board Game Geek. And then after a couple of weeks, he follows up with a review of what people have said and his kind of reaction to it. The videos are always very well made, as is his style, and generally pretty provocative. One of the previous ones, two of them that he did before were, he did one about hype, the idea of hype, and he did one about being a collector versus being a player or whatever else you might call yourself. Is board game collecting a thing that we should do? Both of those were pretty great. His most recent video was titled Overpowered, and engaged with a question that I think is really interesting, particularly in the context of something Rob and I have been talking about a lot with our games, which is the learning curve challenge. So I'm going to give you a couple examples, and then we'll see where my discussion goes. So first, in Rodney's video, which I will link to in the show notes, he discusses the idea of, or the fact that many times when people will play a game, they'll often comment on something seeming overpowered, often just after one or two plays of the game. And he was talking about how, his starting example was that he had played Tapestry several times over the course of a weekend, and I think he played 7 times, and he would consistently see one game someone would win, and people would say, oh, that strategy seems overpowered, but I don't think there's any way you can use strategy B. And then the next game, someone would use strategy B to win, and someone would say, well, that seems overpowered, but there's no way you could use C. And then the next game, someone would use C. He gives a couple other examples of that as well. And basically, the sum of his argument is that we really shouldn't call something overpowered until we've given it a ton of play, because the designers have given it a ton of play, and they can recognize spaces that things like that exist. But in general, you haven't played the game enough to really recognize when something is overpowered or not. It might be your perception of it. And I think generally I agree with him that most of the time when somebody says something is overpowered, my inclination is more just that, well, there are other ways to play the game and you haven't really been playing that way. So 2 other examples from our own design experience. One comes from a game that we have kind of put on the back burner for a bit called In the Loop. In the Loop is a route building tile placement game with a bit of sabotage of the other players, as well as some hidden roles. And the process of playing the game is pretty interesting. In it, you're building the Chicago elevated train system, and the challenge of the game is you're supposed to try to figure out what roles other people are using, because you get paid at the end of the game for how well you had your secret line do, as well as some other money. But being able to make your line do well is a big part of it. And we've had a number of people play who talk about the game not having enough choices, or talk about the game doing this or that, and generally that feedback comes after one play. In particular, the last play we had, which was pretty disappointing, was we had the play with somebody, and when we did the teach, we sort of highlighted that there are these bribery actions you can take that are really powerful, and that players who ignore them do so at their peril. So we set up this idea that here's these briberies, be sure to use them. And then throughout the game, the three of us who'd played before used the bribery actions occasionally, and we all did pretty well. The new player never used them and did pretty poorly, and then sort of talked about how it didn't feel like he had any choices and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, you didn't use the bribery actions that we told you were important. So that's an interesting conundrum that we've come to call the learning curve problem. This is also an issue with our current game, a real-time dice drafting co-op game, which is that when you've played a couple times, it's all easy enough to hold in your head. And the game takes 20 minutes to play, so playing a couple times isn't that big a deal. The challenge of the game shifts as you play, because now once you understand how the game works, then you start to learn strategies to do well. And that, that's what you want in a co-op. You want it to get harder as you play, but also not be super easy. The problem is, it's got to be fun the first time you play, or people don't want to do the second play. And this is, I think, a challenge both for the sort of the perception of something being overpowered, but also just generally the ability to get people to see what's at the core of the game. That if they don't enjoy their first play, often they're not going to try it again. And it's pretty hard to... Then you have to design a game that's really fun to play the first time. Even if what you're trying to design is a game with depth and breadth that rewards study. If you design a game like that, then it's not fun to play the first time. Perhaps. Especially if you're playing with experienced players, right? This is the problem you hear about Root. Or to a degree, some other games. I think Root is the current example of this. Glory to Rome actually gets this tag a little bit too, which is just that if you're playing with people who've played before, it's really not very fun for anybody, because the new player doesn't know what they're doing, and the experienced players just kick their butts. So it's not a challenge. So from that perspective, the figuring out how to make a game both interesting for a first play and interesting for successive plays is a difficult nut to crack, and I think the challenge of the modern designer. One example of a thing that I've encountered a little bit that will help with that is a tutorial mode or a basic mode or a setup mode. A couple examples of that: the game Cerebria comes with a basic mode, which is already very difficult, or has a lot going on. I don't think it's difficult. There's just a lot going on. And once you've learned that, then you can learn the advanced mode, which is where the game really sings, because in the advanced mode you get increased efficiencies and increased bonuses for being thoughtful about which actions you take in what order, as well as trying to win the game. So this doubling effect of the advanced mode is really, it's incredible when you're playing the game, but it's really hard to get other people to the point where they can play the game that way. Similarly, our game that we're working on, Hindsight 2020, we have a learning mode right now, which we often will have people sort of still talk about, like, the learning mode's too hard, or you need another step between the learning mode and the full game. And frankly, we're just kind of nervous that if we take the learning mode and add another step, so step 2 of the learning mode, there's not a lot of people who want to play a game 3 times to get to the actual game, particularly for a game that's 20 minutes. Although maybe that's easier than a game that's 3 hours where you don't get to the full game. So that part, I think that is the inherent challenge of contemporary game design, is how do you make a game that's interesting, deep, and replayable, but at the same time engaging enough on a first play that players want to stick around for a second play. And then how do you do that without making something seem overpowered, right? Because one of the other major filters that people look for these days is multiple paths to victory, particularly for longer games. For shorter games that are under an hour, I think people are less worried about that. I saw very positive reviews about Century, even though Century, there's really just one path to victory. You have to be efficient and buy the scoring cards. There's no other way to win Century. There's differences in how you might choose to be efficient, but really it's just an efficiency puzzle. Whereas there are other games where you really do have multiple paths to victory. Either you're, in an area control game, often you're trying to control a certain amount of the board, and so you could pursue different amounts of the board. You may also have different ways to maneuver your troops. So the complexity of figuring out how to win becomes part of the challenge. Versus a game with only one path to victory, it's maybe easier to grasp, but then people complain that it doesn't have a lot of replayability. So, yeah, I guess I'm sort of inspired in both directions. By the Overpowered conversation makes me want to think about how to shape that first play so that people don't get that impression. But then also the problem of the first play versus the many plays. And how do you make a game that's fun that first time around? Or is it about getting people to see the possibilities that they would find in a second play or a third play? Tom Vassell offered a good suggestion in his review of Tapestry, in which he said Tapestry was good. He gave it the Dice Tower approved, but he also had some complaints. And one of the big complaints was that at the beginning of the game, there are so many factions. It's really hard. If you're brand new, you get dealt a thing. And this is the problem with a drafting game too. If you're brand new to a drafting game and you get dealt a hand of cards, how do you know what you're supposed to pick? It's very challenging. So Vassell's suggestion was, in a game like that where you have a wide variety of options, he said you should have a suggestion about which 3 options or which 4 options you should use for first-time players. They do this in Cerebria. They have suggested decks to use for your emotion cards if you're new to the game. Versus if you're more experienced, then you use sort of more elaborate decks that give you more options. I'm curious to hear from you. What games have you played that had an overpowered section? And was it really overpowered, or is that how sure are you that it was overpowered? What would you use as a judgment of that? Pop over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let me know. And weigh in on this and the question of a learning game. How have games done a good job, complex games done a good job introducing you to the first game, if at all? Perhaps they don't do that. I want to know that too. Tell me all the things by coming over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and letting me know your experience there. Thanks for listening. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.